Welcome. Welcome to Module 3. In the last module, we talked about patterns, how emotionally unhealthy relationships often survive through inconsistency, emotional promises, and intermittent relief cycles. Now, in this module, we're going to begin decoding some of the communication dynamics that create emotional confusion inside unhealthy relationships. And I need to say something important before we begin. This module is not about teaching people to obsess over labels. It's not about turning every disagreement into proof of manipulation. And it's not about convincing people that every emotionally immature behavior is narcissism. This module is about recognition, observation, and clarity. Because one of the most emotionally exhausting experiences inside unhealthy relationships is constantly leaving conversations feeling confused. You walk into the conversation trying to address one issue and somehow leave questioning yourself instead. That emotional destabilization matters. Now, let's begin with one of the most well-known dynamics, gaslighting. Gaslighting is not simply lying. People do lie sometimes. Gaslighting is deeper than that. Gaslighting is communication that destabilizes someone's trust in their own perception, their instincts, their memory, or emotional reality. For example, you bring up something that hurts you, and instead of discussing the issue, the conversation becomes, that never happened. You're imagining things. You always twist everything. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. Over time, repeated emotional invalidation like this can slowly disconnect people from self-trust. Because now the person is no longer just dealing with the original emotional pain. Now they're questioning whether their emotional experience itself is even valid. That creates internal instability, and internal instability creates confusion. Now, again, not every disagreement about memory is gaslighting. People genuinely remember events differently sometimes, but repeated emotional destabilization matters. Especially when someone consistently leaves conversations questioning themselves, defending their reality, or feeling emotionally disorientated afterward. That pattern deserves attention. Now, let's talk about blame shifting. Blame shifting happens when responsibility for harmful behavior constantly gets redirected back onto the other person. For example, you bring up emotional hurt, and suddenly the conversation becomes about your tone, your reaction, your delivery, your flaws, your mistakes. Now, instead of discussing the original behavior, you're defending yourself emotionally. That, once again, creates confusion, especially when it happens repeatedly. And many survivors slowly become trapped in endless emotional defense mode, trying to prove they're reasonable, they're caring, they're communicating correctly, they're not too emotional. But healthy communication should not require someone to constantly defend the validity of their emotional experiences. That's another distinction that matters. Now, another important dynamic is emotional invalidation. Invalidation happens when emotional experiences are minimized, dismissed, mocked, or emotionally downgraded. Example, you're too dramatic. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You always take things personal. You're too needy. You're impossible to talk to. Over time, repeated invalidation can slowly train people to suppress emotional honesty. Because expressing emotions, it begins feeling unsafe. And once emotional honesty becomes unsafe, emotional intimacy becomes impossible. That's important because emotional safety is one of the foundations of healthy relationships. Not perfection, not constant agreement, safety. The ability to express emotions without chronic fear of punishment, humiliation, or dismissal, or emotional reversal, it shouldn't feel that way. Now let's talk about something called DARVO. DARVO stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. This happens when someone responds to accountability by repositioning themselves as the victim instead. For example, you address harmful behavior, and suddenly the response becomes, I can't believe you're attacking me. You're emotionally abusive for bringing this up. You're the real problem. You always make me feel terrible. Now, suddenly, the original issue disappears. And the conversation shifts into you trying to calm, reassure, or defend yourself. That emotional reversal creates major, major confusion, especially when it happens repeatedly. Because many survivors begin feeling guilty simply for expressing emotional discomfort. That's dangerous emotionally. Because healthy relationships allow room for accountability without turning emotional honesty into emotional warfare. Now let's talk about emotional withdrawal. This is another dynamic that deeply affects emotional stability. Emotional withdrawal may look like silent treatment, disappearing emotionally, coldness, distance, shutting down communication, withholding affection, or emotionally disconnecting after conflict. Now, let me be careful here. People sometimes do need space. Healthy people can temporarily withdraw to regulate emotions. But, use but here, repeated emotional withdrawal used as punishment or control creates instability. Especially when communication becomes hot and cold, close then distant, connected then emotionally unavailable. That unpredictability creates anxiety. And many survivors begin adapting themselves emotionally just to avoid triggering withdrawal. Again, literally, that's emotional survival mode. Now, one of the biggest things I want you to understand in this module is this. Emotionally unhealthy communication often creates confusion through contradiction. Someone says, I love you, but repeatedly invalidates you. Someone says, I care, but repeatedly destabilizes you emotionally. Someone says, I want honesty, but punishes honesty emotionally. That contradiction forces the nervous system into constant emotional analysis, trying to reconcile words and patterns, promises and behaviors, affection and instability. And over time, many survivors become trapped trying to solve emotional inconsistency instead of recognizing it. That's why clarity matters so much. Now, another important point, manipulative dynamics are not always loud. Sometimes manipulation sounds calm, it sounds soft, quiet, subtle. Sometimes the most emotionally destabilizing relationships are not built on screaming. They're actually built on chronic emotional confusion. And once again, that's very important because many survivors dismiss their experiences simply because the relationship doesn't look abusive enough. But emotional instability still affects the nervous system. Repeated confusion still affects self-trust, and emotional inconsistency still affects emotional safety. Now, let's talk briefly about healthy communication, because this course is not just about recognizing unhealthy patterns, it's also about understanding what emotional safety actually looks like. Healthy communication allows accountability, clarification, repair, mutual understanding, and emotional honesty. Healthy disagreements may still feel uncomfortable. I get it. But they do not consistently leave people emotionally destabilized or disconnected from themselves. And that distinction matters enormously. Now, before we close this module, I want you to think about something honestly. After difficult conversations in your relationship, do you usually feel understood, grounded, emotionally resolved, or do you feel confused, anxious, emotionally drained, and unsure what just happened? That question definitely matters because confusion after conflict is important information. And many survivors stay emotionally trapped because they normalize emotional destabilization for too long. But repeated emotional confusion should never become your definition of love. Now, in the next module, we're going to go deeper into one of the most powerful attachment systems inside emotionally unhealthy relationships, trauma bonds. Why leaving feels so difficult, why emotional relief becomes addictive, and why emotionally unstable relationships can feel incredibly hard to let go of, even when they're causing emotional harm. Let's continue decoding these patterns together, and let me try to not tongue twist these words anymore. See you in the next module.